August the 14th, 2005, an airliner full of frozen, unconscious passengers slams into a Greek hillside. The official investigation finds the main cause to be a single switch left in the wrong position. But it's nowhere near that simple. In this video, I'll be uncovering the links to other incidents, the cover-ups on the ground, and the strange behaviour of the pilots that could even suggest the crash wasn't an accident, along with the incredible story of the flight attendants who took the controls themselves. Just after 6 a.m. local time, Helios Flight 522, a Boeing 737, lifts off from Larnaca Airport in Cyprus on what should be a routine trip to Prague via Athens, but instead is about to turn into one of the most terrifying flights ever recorded. On board are 115 passengers, around a third of them children. Ordinary people, like the Tutungian family. Evstathia Musa and fiancé Giannis on their first holiday together, and Demos Shururipa with his wife Margarita and their daughters Sophia and Ioana. The flight is commanded by Captain Hans-Jürgen Merton, aged 59, with First Officer Pampos Charalampos, aged 51. Two of the cabin crew have switched to the flight at the last minute. Chief Cabin Attendant Luisa Buteri, who is due to be married in a few weeks, has taken the shift as a favour for a friend. Andreas Prodomru has also agreed to an extra shift, simply because it means he can fly with his girlfriend Haris Charalampos, who's also a cabin attendant. Their behaviour over the next few hours will be a central part of the unfolding mystery. Just 7 minutes into the flight, Captain Merton contacts Helios Operations Centre to report an odd situation. The aircraft's takeoff configuration warning alarm siren is sounding, something that should only be possible on the ground. Also, he says there's a problem with the cooling system. Merton discusses the problem with a ground engineer, but abruptly cuts off the conversation after a few minutes. Soon after 6:20 a.m., still less than 15 minutes into the flight, the operations manager tries to call the crew again, but there is no further communication with Flight 522. As the aircraft is on the correct course and altitude though, climbing to 34,000 feet, there is no undue concern on the ground. All seems well until 7:30 a.m, when, instead of descending for a landing in Athens as planned, the 737 overflies the airport and goes into a holding pattern, circling nearby. Less than 4 years after the horror of 9/11, airlines are still very fearful of hijacking attempts. So, with controllers still unable to contact the pilots, two Greek F-16 fighters scramble to intercept the aircraft. And what they find is far worse than a hijacking. At 8:32, the F-16 pilots make an unbelievable radio report. The 737 is flying normally and seems completely undamaged. But through the cabin windows, they can see passengers wearing oxygen masks, slumped over, either unconscious or dead. In the cockpit, the captain's seat is empty, and the first officer is also slumped over the controls, but wearing no oxygen mask. And things are about to get even stranger. As the fighter pilots look on, a figure suddenly appears in the cockpit. Taking the empty captain's seat, he begins to wrestle with the controls. A faint "Mayday" call is heard, the first communication from the aircraft for over 2.5 hours. And it seems that another person may be trying to move the co-pilot. Starved of fuel, the engines flame out, and Flight 522 begins to sink earthwards. The figure in the cockpit makes a despairing gesture to the helpless fighter pilots, indicating the aircraft is crashing. Whoever is flying the plane manages to turn it away from a built-up area, but can't prevent the inevitable. 3 hours after takeoff, Flight 522 crashes into a hillside near the village of Grammatico. There are no survivors. The results of the inquiry into the crash are shocking. Once in the air, all airliners need to be pressurized inside to give those aboard enough oxygen to breathe. On Flight 522, it seems the switch controlling that system had been set in the wrong position, on manual rather than auto. As it climbed into the thin, cold air higher than Mount Everest, those on board would have slowly suffocated and began to freeze solid, leaving Flight 22 a ghost ship, doomed to fly its pre-programmed course on autopilot. But was it really that simple? Could the position of this one switch, shown after recovery from the wreckage, really be the cause of such a massive loss of life? That official explanation leaves many unanswered questions. Why did the pilots not set the switch correctly, even though it was part of their pre-flight checklist? Why did they ignore the warning systems that activated during the flight? And who was the figure struggling to fly the plane? Was that person really trying to save it, or were they responsible for the incident and trying to crash it? Perhaps above all, how could that person still be alive and conscious long after everyone else, including the pilots, seemed to be unconscious or dead? The behaviour of the pilots on that August morning was certainly puzzling. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merton was born in the former East Germany and had huge experience, with nearly 17,000 flying hours, 5,500 of them on the 737 aircraft alone. So in theory, he should have known the aircraft inside out. He was a freelance pilot working for Helios over the busy summer season. But he wasn't well liked, described by former colleagues as being an old-school command pilot, possessing poor communication skills and a tendency to be domineering and abrupt with his crews. First Officer Pampos Charalampos had been with the airline for 5 years and had already privately expressed anger at Merton's behaviour. More than that, his performance as a first officer had caused previous concerns. He sometimes failed to follow the all-important checklists or monitor the aircraft systems properly. As a result of all these factors, he was unhappy at Helios and looking for a job with a different airline. Charalampos was also keeping a diary of issues that concerned him, both about Helios and the aircraft itself. According to son Yanis, he once told me that if any of it ever got out, the company would close. As we'll see, that diary was later recovered from the wreckage, and the prediction came true. A bad atmosphere on the flight deck would always be a concern, but with an angry, disillusioned first officer whose career at the airline had already been troubled, the question has to be asked, could Pampos Charalampos have deliberately sabotaged the flight? Because the switch, that single switch that controlled the aircraft pressurization, was on his side of the aircraft, and his responsibility to monitor. Did his grievances turn into a crazed plan for revenge, to crash the plane, kill himself, and leave his diary behind as proof that would destroy Helios Airways forever? Cases of death by pilot, where a crew member deliberately crashes the aircraft they're piloting, have grown rapidly since they were first recognised by airlines in the 1990s, though often it's very hard to prove. It's estimated to be the second most frequent cause of airline disasters since 2011, and is often cited as an explanation for the disappearance of MH370. In at least 3 cases, the co-pilot is thought to have locked the captain out of the cockpit in order to carry out his plan. Could that be what happened on Flight 522? It might explain why the captain's seat was empty when the F-16s intercepted the airliner, also the lack of communication. And another event just hours earlier might have been the final motivation for the first officer to act. On its previous flight from London to Larnaca just hours earlier, the crew had reported issues with the seal on a rear door. The aircraft had been inspected overnight by engineer Helios Chief Ground Engineer Alan Irwin. As part of a test, he had switched the pressurization system to manual, but testified that he had reset it to auto after completing his work, just 3 hours before the plane took off for the final time. Was finding that there had been yet another issue with an aircraft enough to push Pampos Charalampos over the edge and put his plan into action? Did he deliberately put the pressurization switch back to manual, knowing what to do? It's not inconceivable, but flight data recovered after the crash confirmed the alarm, which sounded soon after takeoff, was actually telling them that the pressurization system was wrongly configured. So why did the captain not act on this and instead report faults with the takeoff configuration warning and cooling system? Mertens' conversation with his operations centre offers more clues. The engineer he spoke with was Alan Irwin, the man who'd checked the aircraft just hours earlier. Irwin didn't understand the captain's messages. "Both my equipment cooling lights are off. This is normal. Can you confirm the problem?" "They are not switched off." Crucially, Irwin then asked, "Can you confirm that the pressurization panel is selected to auto?" The captain wasn't making sense, and Irwin wanted to make sure that he wasn't suffering the effects of lack of oxygen or hypoxia. Initially, these do include confusion and irrationality, which is why Irwin directly asked him to check the panel that contained the pressurization switch. But the captain ignored the question and replied, "Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?" before ending the call. As the first officer was also part of the conversation, both pilots had missed another chance to save Flight 522 and all aboard. Was it a misunderstanding or a deliberate act? If the captain had deliberately ignored the warning, then he too must have been attempting to kill all of those on board the plane. But it seems very unlikely that both pilots would be planning the same thing. The alternative explanation is that, as Alan Irwin suspected, the captain was already suffering from the onset of hypoxia and was too confused to understand what was happening. Ultimately, the theory that the co-pilot may have acted deliberately is also impossible to prove. With his history of poor checklist discipline and systems monitoring, he may simply have failed to set the system properly in the first place. And an unlikely new suspect was about to emerge. In any aircraft accident, everyone wants someone to blame, and both Helios Airways and Boeing, the manufacturer of the aircraft, seemed desperate to make sure that the blame didn't fall on them. Boeing denied any liability. During the Greek court cases, the company's lawyer claimed at least 16 separate mistakes were made by the ground staff, the flight deck crew, and the passenger cabin crew. If any of these mistakes had not been made, the accident would not have happened. Since the pilots and cabin crew were dead, it was staff on the ground who became the fall guys. Incredibly, 4 people, including Alan Irwin, the engineer who tried to make the pilots check that the pressurization switch was set correctly, were found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 121 years each in prison, a year for every life lost on Flight 522. But a different story soon began to emerge. Not only was the aircraft that crashed found to have had previous issues with pressurization, it was revealed that crews on at least 10 other Boeing 737s had similar experiences in the years before Flight 522 crashed. Worse, the warning siren that sounded for a pressurization problem was the same one that sounded for a takeoff configuration warning. And in many of the other cases reported, the pilots had made exactly the same mistakes as the crew of Flight 522, believing the wrong system was to blame. So was the root cause a design fault in the 737 itself? After initially denying any problems and blaming everyone else, Boeing was forced to admit that not only did it know about the other cases, but had also received 2 safety notifications from Irish and American aviation safety bodies, recommending that the warning system should be improved. Shockingly, the company ignored both recommendations. Had they acted, all 121 people aboard Flight 522 may have survived. The revelations also opened a sinister possibility. Could the switch have been put into the manual position after the flight to shift the blame away from the aircraft and onto the pilots and ground crew? The official examination of the switch concluded that no, it was definitely in the manual position during flight. That examination was conducted by Boeing themselves. Though no charges were ever brought against the manufacturer, families of victims did successfully sue them for an undisclosed sum in damages for the deaths of their loved ones. The United States Federal Aviation Authority also issued a number of directives to Boeing designed to reduce instances of pressurization issues and make the warning system less confusing. Alan Irwin's conviction was quashed on appeal. If there had been a conspiracy to frame him for the accident, it had failed. Eventually, in 2011, Boeing began to refit its 737s with a different alarm siren and warning lights to notify the crew of pressurization issues, though the company still maintained the Greek Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board and the Greek courts independently found that the direct cause of the Helios accident were a failure to follow standard operational procedures. Whether the fault actually was with the switch position or perhaps another pressurization issue, the outcome was the same. At the time of the conversation with Irwin, both pilots were probably already suffering from hypoxia, with probably just seconds of consciousness remaining. Neither recognised the symptoms, so failed to don oxygen masks as they should have. It's likely Captain Merton left his seat to look for the circuit breakers that he thought were the cause of the problem and collapsed on the cockpit floor, explaining the empty seats spotted by the fighter pilots. Charalampus, equally disorientated, may have lost consciousness at around the same time, leaving 4 flight attendants and 118 passengers to face an appalling ordeal. The horror of what happened in the passenger cabin of Flight 522 is impossible to imagine, and that's probably just as well. Yet there were also clues that point to an extraordinary story of bravery. What we do know for sure is that during the pilot's conversation with Alan Irwin, the emergency oxygen masks in the passenger cabin were automatically deployed. After making sure the passengers put them on, the flight attendants, who had their own portable oxygen supplies, would have strapped themselves in to their landing positions, chief and first attendant at the front, second and third attendants at the rear. Each passenger face mask was connected to a chemical generator providing around 12 minutes of oxygen, enough for the aircraft to make an emergency descent to an altitude where the air is breathable. Yet, unknown to them all, the pilots were already unconscious, and instead of descending, the autopilot kept the 737 climbing, making the air even thinner and even colder. The 12 minutes would have passed, leaving the cabin crew with no idea of what was happening, watching helplessly as their passengers gradually began to slip into unconsciousness. Possibly there was panic, though most passengers were still strapped into their seats when their bodies were recovered, so probably didn't even realise what was happening. Whether the flight attendants attempted to keep some or all of the passengers conscious by sharing their own supplies will never be known, but it couldn't have worked. Eventually, gasping for air and shivering uncontrollably, it's likely all the passengers became unresponsive. Post-mortem examinations showed that most of them were still just about alive at the time of impact, though deeply comatose and frozen, far beyond help, even if that help had come. But what about the flight attendants themselves? Their oxygen supplies would have lasted for several hours, which brings us to the final and most intriguing mystery of Flight 522. The actions of the 2 flight attendants at the back of the aircraft, Andreas Prodromou and his girlfriend, Haris Charalampus. Because Andreas wasn't just a flight attendant, but a qualified commercial airline pilot, temping as a steward until he could find a job in the cockpit. Incredibly, it seems the pair made an extraordinary attempt to save the aircraft. Andreas was the figure who was spotted by the fighter pilots climbing into the pilot's seat, the person who sent the Mayday messages and managed to steer the aircraft away from habitation as it fell from the sky. But why did he wait till so late in the flight before trying to act? Though not qualified to operate the Boeing 737, as a pilot, he would have had enough experience and understanding of the situation to realise that something was wrong as soon as the pilots failed to begin emergency descent. Even without the experience to fly the aircraft, he could have sent out a Mayday earlier, and with help from the ground, at least brought the aircraft to an altitude where those aboard could breathe again. Even better, why could he not have revived the pilots themselves using the bottled oxygen? At the very least, surely the flight attendants would have gone to check what was happening in the cockpit. During one of the previous Boeing 737 pressurization incidents, a flight attendant had done exactly that. As soon as the oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, she rushed to the cockpit, only to find the two pilots in the early stages of hypoxia. Her actions may well have prevented a similar disaster, so why did the same not happen on Flight 522? In a terrible irony, it could be that a safety feature installed after 9/11 to prevent loss of life actually doomed those on Flight 522. In an effort to prevent similar hijackings following the attacks on the Twin Towers, rules were introduced that all cockpit doors had to be heavily armoured and accessible only with a key code known to the pilots and chief flight attendant. The reason Andreas didn't get into the cockpit sooner may be horribly simple. He didn't have the door code. But would the chief flight attendant, Louisa Vuteri, not just tell him the code? Had she not been given it for that flight? Perhaps she'd already tried to get into the cockpit and failed, and was already laying unconscious by the time Andreas decided to act. On the other hand, the entry code can also be overridden by the pilots themselves from the cockpit. So was it a case of death by pilot after all? These are questions that will never be answered, but whatever the reason, it seems likely that Andreas was locked out of the cockpit with a seemingly impossible task: to find a way to break through a bulletproof door before the plane ran out of fuel. In a later death by pilot incident, in which the co-pilot of a German wings flight allegedly locked his captain out of the cockpit and deliberately crashed the plane, the crew tried and failed to hack through the cockpit door with an emergency axe, the sounds of their desperate attempts clearly audible on the black box flight recorder recovered after the crash. There are no such sounds of forced entry on Flight 522, no indication of how he did finally gain entry. But DNA traces suggest both he and Harris were in the cockpit at the time of the crash. The F-16 pilots noted that the co-pilot seemed to shift position slightly. Was this Harris trying to lift him from his seat in order to help Andreas at the controls? We'll never know, as tragically, it was all too late. After a desperate and horrifying battle, surrounded by the frozen living corpses of their passengers, the pair could do little more than watch the hillside rising up to meet them. There is much we'll never understand about the strange fate of Flight 522, but as First Officer Pampos Charalampos predicted, once its safety failings were revealed, Helios Airlines went out of business. Even though it took several years and some more near misses, Boeing did finally upgrade all the 737 fleet with a better warning system for pressurization faults, and the actions of those who tried their best to save the flight aren't forgotten. Sometime after the accident, Andreas's father received a letter from a pilot who'd trained with his son. Since the Helios accident, my own airline has introduced an item on the checklist which we now carry out before every flight. Each time I carry out this check, I am reminded of Andreas, and I quietly ask him to keep us safe in the journey ahead. For the rest of my career, I will remember him every day I fly. For more mysteries of the air, check out these great videos too, and be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.